I still remember the smell of the red clay in Savannah after the rain. I was barely 22, and the world felt both too big and too small for a girl with calloused hands and a heart full of dreams. My mama used to say, "Sylvia, God gives every woman a thread, but it's up to her to sew her own destiny." I didn't understand back then. But that sentence followed me all the way to New York City. The day I left Georgia, I wore a yellow dress I'd sewn myself. The seams weren't perfect, but they held, just like my faith. I carried one suitcase, a photo of my parents, and a small Bible with my name engraved in gold. The bus ride to New York felt endless. Each mile whispered a promise I didn't yet know how to believe. Before I go on, I want to say this from my heart. May God bless you with His endless love, filling your days with health, peace, joy, and unshakable faith. Never forget, God never abandons us. His love is eternal and infinite. And if you're enjoying this story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me so much. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. When I first arrived in the city, I couldn't stop staring at the skyline. It was like someone had built a forest out of steel and light. But I didn't feel small. Not really. I felt cold. I thought, if those buildings can rise from nothing, maybe I can too. I didn't know where I'd live or work, but I knew I wouldn't give up. Brooklyn became my first home. Not the fancy kind, just a small apartment with peeling paint and thin walls that carried the sound of babies crying and couples arguing. But it was alive. There was laughter too, and music from the neighbor's window every Sunday afternoon. It was rough, but it was mine. Every morning, I walked to the corner deli for coffee and a bagel. The man behind the counter, Mr. Ahmed, called me Miss Sunshine, because I always smiled even when I had no reason to. I guess that's how I survived. I learned to smile through the ache. To wear hope like lipstick. To believe that maybe tomorrow would be kinder. I started mending clothes for neighbors just to earn a few dollars. One woman brought me her husband's torn jacket, and when I returned it, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. That was the first time I realized, sewing wasn't just work. It was healing. Stitch by stitch, I was mending more than fabric. I was mending myself. Some nights, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker like tiny candles. I missed Georgia. The warmth, the quiet, the familiar scent of magnolias. But something in me whispered, "Keep going." I knew deep down that God hadn't brought me this far to abandon me halfway. The winters hit me hard. I'd never seen real snow before. My fingers cracked from the cold, and sometimes I'd cry just trying to thread a needle. But then I'd hear Mama's voice in my mind. "Sylvia, strength ain't loud. It's steady." So I kept sewing, kept walking, kept believing. When I finally found a small job at a tailor shop in Brooklyn, I thought it was a miracle. The owner, Mr. Goldstein, was strict but fair. He taught me how to cut patterns and finish hems like a professional. I started saving every penny, dreaming of something more, though I didn't yet know what more would look like. My weekends were for the laundromat and church. Oh, church was my anchor. The choir's voices filled that old brick building with something divine. I remember standing there, hands raised, eyes wet, whispering, "Lord, don't let me be invisible in this city." I didn't want fame, I just wanted purpose. Then I met Charles. He had kind eyes and a deep laugh that made me forget my worries. We met on a Sunday after service, and he said, "You got a light in you, Sylvia." Back then, I thought he was my forever. I didn't know how much that forever would test me. We moved into a small apartment in Harlem. Life was simple, and we were happy, at least at first. I kept sewing from home while Charles worked construction. We'd sit by the fire escape at night, watching the city glow below. I believed love would be enough to hold us together. Years went by, and the city changed, and so did we. Rent went up, babies came, bills piled. But I kept the faith. Every hardship felt like another layer of fabric I had to cut and reshape. Some nights I'd whisper to God, "Just give me one more day of strength." And somehow, He always did. When my first son was born, I looked at his tiny fingers and felt a kind of love I didn't know existed. It was terrifying, to love that much. I prayed that he'd never have to feel the hunger or fear I once did. I promised I'd do whatever it took to protect him, even if it meant losing myself. Brooklyn was full of sounds, the rumble of trains, the shouting of street vendors, the rhythm of life that never stopped. It made me feel alive, even when I was exhausted. There was something magical about knowing everyone around me was chasing something too: hope, love, survival. I used to watch the older women on the stoops, gossiping and laughing, wearing bright scarves and strong perfume. They looked unshakable. I wanted to be like them, grounded, graceful, unbothered by the storms. I didn't know that one day, I'd be that woman for someone else. There were nights when loneliness hit hard. Charles worked late, the kids slept, and I'd sit at my sewing machine until dawn. The hum of the motor felt like company. I'd hum hymns from church, thinking about Mama's words. So your destiny, Sylvia. Maybe she knew this was what she meant all along. I found beauty in small things: the smell of fresh bread from the bakery downstairs, the laughter of my kids chasing each other through the hallway, the way sunlight fell across my old Singer machine. It reminded me that grace often hides in ordinary places. Once, a neighbor asked if I missed Georgia. I smiled and said, every day. But what I didn't say was that New York had become my test of faith, and my redemption. It wasn't easy, but neither was I. Every challenge carved me a little deeper, made me softer and stronger all at once. There was a night I almost gave up. The rent was due, the fridge was empty, and the baby had a fever. I remember kneeling on the kitchen floor, crying, whispering, "Lord, I can't do this." And then, I felt peace. Not because things got better, but because I wasn't alone in the storm. I learned to see God not just in church, but in the laundromat, in the subway, in strangers' kindness. When someone held a door, or smiled at me on the street, I saw his hand at work. That faith became my armor, invisible but powerful. Over time, the city became a map of my story. Every street corner held a memory. The bodega on Fulton Street where I bought milk after midnight. The bench in Prospect Park where I cried after my first miscarriage. The church steps where I first sang again after months of silence. It's strange how the same streets that once scared you can later feel like home. I realized that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about grace. God's grace. It stitched the broken parts of me into something beautiful, even when I didn't see it happening. Sometimes I'd sit on the rooftop, looking at the skyline, thinking how far I'd come. From red dirt roads to concrete dreams. I wasn't rich, but I was grateful. Every mistake, every tear, every night spent sewing, they were threads in the same fabric of my becoming. People used to say I was just a seamstress. But they didn't know the truth. My hands built a life from scraps. I turned worn fabric into gowns, and fear into faith. I wasn't just anything. I was a woman who refused to stop creating, even when the world told her to quit. And maybe that's why I stayed in New York all those years. Because the city, like me, never slept. It kept rebuilding itself no matter how many times it fell apart. I learned that same rhythm. Fall, rise, repeat. Until the pattern becomes strength. Now when I look back, I can see how every stitch, every tear, every prayer shaped me. I didn't just move from Georgia to New York. I moved mountains I didn't even know I had inside me. But what came next? That was the real test. Because sometimes, the hardest battles aren't outside. They're at home. When I first stepped into the Perfect Fit tailor shop in Brooklyn, the smell of fabric and steam hit me like home. Mr. Goldstein handed me a pair of dull scissors and said, "Show me what your hands can do." My palms were trembling, but I smiled anyway. That was the start of everything. The place where I learned how to stitch not just clothes, but courage. Those first days were long. I'd stand by the window table, stitching hems until my fingers felt numb. Customers came and went, most in a hurry, few with a smile. But every time I finished a piece, I'd whisper a small, "thank you" under my breath. Gratitude became my secret prayer between stitches. I loved watching people's faces when they tried on a jacket I'd altered. The way their posture changed, how confidence bloomed just from a perfect fit. It made me believe that maybe I was doing something holy, restoring more than fabric, restoring dignity. Maybe God had hidden his purpose in a spool of thread. Then came the first shift. One morning, Mr. Goldstein told me business was slow. "You're good, Sylvia," he said, "but we can't afford 2 full-timers." I nodded, pretending it didn't hurt. That night, I walked home through snow, the city lights blurring behind tears. Change was knocking again, and I wasn't ready. I took small jobs, hemming curtains, fixing school uniforms, altering dresses for Sunday church ladies. I'd sew until midnight, whispering hymns to keep my spirit alive. The machine's hum became my lullaby. When you're a mother, you don't get to rest when you're tired. You rest when your children are safe. After a few months, I found work as a hotel seamstress at the Hilton Midtown. It felt glamorous at first. Chandeliers, silk gowns, people speaking in accents I couldn't place. But behind those walls, it was chaos. Deadlines, pressure, supervisors shouting. I sewed in silence, swallowing my pride like bitter medicine. I met women from all over the world. Maria from the Philippines, Clara from Jamaica, Ruth from Alabama. We became sisters in survival, trading stories over cheap coffee during our 10-minute breaks. We laughed to keep from crying, prayed for better shifts, and shared lunches made from yesterday's leftovers. One evening, the manager called me in. "We're cutting costs," he said. "You're one of the best, but seniority wins." I smiled again, just like before. That night, I walked through Times Square, the lights mocking my tears. I thought about how dreams fade quietly, not with thunder, but with paperwork. Still, I didn't break. I started again, this time at the Plaza Hotel. Different building, same story. Long hours, aching hands, and that constant ticking clock. I used to joke that I could measure my life in thread and time cards. Each stitch, a reminder of what I was sacrificing to stay afloat. At the Plaza, I fixed gowns for women who never knew my name. They'd hand me dresses worth more than my month's rent and say, "Make it perfect." I'd nod, knowing perfection was all I had left to give. When you live on the edge, excellence becomes your only protection. I remember once sewing a bridal gown at 2 in the morning, alone in the empty fitting room. I held the dress against my chest and thought, what would it feel like to be loved like this? But love back then was something I kept mending too. It was always torn somewhere. There were weeks when Charles barely came home. I told myself he was tired, overworked. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. In him, in us. The silence between us grew heavier than any fabric I'd ever handled. I tried to stitch us back together, but he kept pulling at the seams. When I moved to the Intercontinental Manhattan, I thought maybe a new start would fix things. The pay was better, and the hours more flexible. But life doesn't always pay you in peace. Sometimes it just pays you enough to keep going. I learned to smile on cue, even when my heart was breaking. My oldest son, Marcus, started high school around that time. I wanted him to see strength in me, not exhaustion. So I hid my fears behind laughter, behind stories about the fancy people at work. I didn't want him to inherit my struggles, just my resilience. Every night, after putting the kids to bed, I'd sit with my sewing kit by the window. The moonlight made the threads shine like silver. I'd whisper, "Lord, make me strong enough to get through tomorrow." That became my ritual, not out of routine, but out of survival. Sometimes, I'd close my eyes and imagine I was still in Savannah, under the magnolia trees, Mama singing hymns while I practiced my first stitches. The memory soothed me. It reminded me that beginnings don't disappear, they just hide beneath the weight of living. Then came the layoffs. The hotel union changed contracts, and I was let go again. I packed my scissors and thimble like they were relics from a past life. For the first time in years, I didn't know what to do next. But giving up was never an option. Not for me. not with 3 mouths to feed. So I started taking whatever jobs came my way: alterations, cleaning, even mending torn curtains for small offices. I became a quiet hustler, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to rest. The city was my workshop, my battlefield, my test. One winter morning, the subway stalled for nearly an hour. People complained, cursed, pushed. But I just sat there, holding my sewing kit on my lap, thinking how life was a lot like that train. Sometimes you stop without warning, but the tracks still go somewhere. You just have to wait for the signal. There were moments when I questioned everything. My choices, my worth, my strength. But then I'd see my children sleeping, peaceful, unaware of the weight I carried. That was enough. They were my reason, my reward, my reminder that sacrifice was never wasted. Once, while sewing a uniform for a hotel doorman, he asked, "Don't you ever get tired of fixing other people's things?" I smiled and said, "No, because every stitch keeps me from falling apart." He didn't understand, but God did. My faith grew quieter but deeper during those years. I stopped asking why and started saying, "Thank you. Thank you for another day, another breath, another chance to start again." Sometimes gratitude is the only light left in the room. There was a Sunday I'll never forget. The church sermon was about the woman who touched Jesus' garment and was healed. I cried through the whole service. Because I understood that story, that hunger for wholeness, that belief that a single thread of faith could change everything. When I walked home that day, I saw a "Help Wanted" sign in a store window, selling accessories downtown. I almost kept walking. But something told me to stop. I took a deep breath and walked in. The manager smiled, and just like that, my life shifted again. It wasn't sewing, but it was something. I learned to talk to strangers, to sell with kindness, to listen to people's stories. Turns out, every woman buying a scarf or a hat was really buying a little confidence. And somehow, I was giving it, even when I barely had any left for myself. I used to think sewing was my calling, but maybe it was just one language of love God had given me. Maybe He was teaching me new ones now, the language of survival, of resilience, of reinvention. I started to see every setback not as punishment, but as preparation. Looking back, I can see the pattern. Every layoff, every move, every long night at the machine, it wasn't random. It was God shifting the fabric of my life into something greater. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew then was that change had come again, and this time, it would test more than my hands. Because soon, the needle would stop. And I'd have to learn to sew without it. Losing that last hotel job felt like watching a thread snap mid-seam. Sudden, painful, final. I remember standing on the curb outside the Intercontinental, clutching my last paycheck, the city roaring around me like it didn't care. For a moment, I didn't either. I just stood there, letting the wind whip through my coat. And then I whispered, "Lord, what now?" A week later, I found myself walking down Fifth Avenue, looking for Help Wanted signs like a beggar looks for bread. That's when I saw it, a small shop called Urban Spark Accessories. The windows shimmered with scarves, earrings, and handbags, all brighter than my mood. I pushed the door open, and a bell chimed like a tiny prayer being answered. The manager, a tall woman named Miss Denise, looked me up and down. "You ever sold accessories before?" she asked. "No," I said softly, "but I know what makes a woman feel beautiful." She smiled and said, "Then you're hired." Just like that, I went from stitching hems to selling shine. At first, it felt strange not to hear the hum of a sewing machine. My hands missed the rhythm. But I learned the rhythm of conversation instead, the give and take, the laughter, the stories people carried. I sold more than scarves. I sold a moment of confidence to women who'd forgotten their sparkle. It amazed me how a simple pair of earrings could lift a woman's spirit. One customer, Mrs. Powell, told me she hadn't worn jewelry since her husband passed. I helped her pick a pearl brooch, and when she looked in the mirror, her eyes filled with tears. That day, I realized I was still in the business of mending. Only now, I was mending hearts. There were slow days too. Days when the city seemed to swallow people whole, when no one came in, and I sat by the window watching the rain streak the glass. Those were the moments I'd start humming old hymns, remembering Mama's voice back in Savannah. Her faith was stitched into every memory I had. One afternoon, Miss Denise handed me a bonus envelope. "You've got the highest sales this month," she said, grinning. I laughed, half in disbelief. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not for what I could make with my hands, but for what I could give with my heart. But life, as always, has its shifts. A few months later, the shop closed without warning. Rent had gone up. Sales had gone down. Denise hugged me and said, "You'll land on your feet, Sylvia. You always do." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe God hadn't forgotten my name. That night, I went home and pulled out my old sewing machine. It was dusty, tired, like me. But when I plugged it in and heard that familiar hum, something inside me came back to life. It was like God whispering, "You still have your gift. Use it." I started taking small sewing jobs from home again, fixing uniforms, altering prom dresses, stitching patches for neighborhood kids. The sound of the needle piercing fabric became my heartbeat. The machine didn't just feed us. It comforted me. It gave me back my rhythm. Soon, word spread. Women from church, friends of friends, even hotel staff came by with clothes that needed Sylvia's touch. I didn't advertise. I just worked quietly, letting the results speak for themselves. My little apartment turned into a workshop filled with laughter, music, and the smell of starch and steam. Sometimes I'd look around and think, maybe this is what success looks like, not fancy, but faithful. I wasn't rich, but I was working for myself. Every thread I pulled felt like reclaiming a piece of my power. After all those years of serving others, I was finally serving my own purpose again. There was a day I'll never forget, a rush order for a garment factory in the garment district. They needed help meeting a deadline, and someone recommended me. I took the train, nervous but hopeful. When I walked in and saw rows of women bent over machines, it felt like coming home, and yet, stepping into a new world. The foreman handed me a pile of fabric and said, "Let's see what you can do." I finished faster than anyone else. By the end of the week, he offered me regular work-from-home orders. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. God had turned my little machine into a lifeline. Every morning, I'd rise before the sun, make coffee, and start sewing while the city was still half asleep. My window faced the street, and sometimes I'd see joggers passing by, chasing fitness while I chased rent. We were all running towards something. I just hoped I was running in the right direction. There were nights when I'd fall asleep at the machine, fabric still in my lap, the soft click of the motor echoing in my dreams. I didn't mind. That sound reminded me that I was still creating, still breathing, still fighting. Hope, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly in the corner of your room. Marcus helped me pack orders for delivery sometimes. Watching him tape boxes with that same focus had filled me with pride. I told him, "Son, these hands built everything we have." He smiled and said, "I know, Mom." That moment stayed with me, because it meant he saw me, really saw me. But then came another turn. The machine jammed one night. Smoke, sparks, panic. I unplugged it fast, heart racing. It was old, older than some of my kids. And now it was gone. I cried over that broken machine like it was a person. It had carried me through storms. Losing it felt like losing a friend. The next morning, I prayed harder than I had in years. "Lord, if you still want me to sew, make a way." And within a week, a woman from church called, saying she had an extra machine she didn't use anymore. "The Lord told me to give it to you," she said. I just sat there, tears streaming down, whispering, "Thank you." That second machine became my partner in rebirth. It wasn't as smooth as my old one, but it had spirit. Every time I turned it on, I felt grace moving through the gears. It was as if God Himself was saying, "Keep going, daughter." The story isn't over yet. As my small business grew, I started dreaming again. Maybe one day I could open my own studio, a little place for women like me, where work meant dignity and laughter. I even sketched a sign, Sylvia's Hands. I pinned it on my wall, right above the machine. It wasn't real yet, but it was a promise. Some weekends, I'd take the kids to Central Park with a picnic. I'd sit on the grass, watching the clouds drift by, thinking how strange life is, how pain and purpose can share the same sky. The city that once broke me now held me like an old friend. There was a quiet pride that came with every completed dress, every paid order. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was creating again. It felt like breathing clean air after years underwater. Freedom didn't always come from escape. Sometimes it came from returning to what you were made to do. Then one evening, while delivering a package downtown, I saw my reflection in a store window. Gray strands, tired eyes, but still standing. I whispered, "You made it through again." The woman staring back looked older, yes, but also wiser. Stronger. Maybe even beautiful. That night, as I closed my eyes, I heard the machine humming softly beside me. It was almost like a lullaby from heaven, a reminder that faith doesn't always change the situation, but it changes the heart that endures it. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of another chapter. Because soon, I'd learn that education, not sewing, would become the next mountain God asked me to climb. The idea came to me one night while I was ironing school uniforms for my youngest. The TV was on, and a woman was talking about adult education programs in the city. I remember pausing, iron mid-air, thinking, could I? The thought scared me, not because I couldn't do it, but because I wanted it so badly. 4 years, I'd put everyone else's dreams before mine. My children had diplomas, my husband had a job, my neighbors had routines. But me. I had unfinished pages. I could sew a wedding gown blindfolded, but I couldn't fill out a simple form without help. That truth gnawed at me every single day. So I made a decision, one I kept secret at first. I went down to the community center in Queens and asked about night classes. The clerk smiled and handed me a stack of forms. I remember my hands trembling as I signed my name. It felt like signing a pact with my younger self. The first night of class, I almost didn't go. Dinner was late, the bus was delayed, and my husband laughed when I told him my plan. "At your age," he said, "who's gonna hire a grandma with a GED?" I smiled anyway, because deep down, I knew this wasn't about a job. It was about worth. The classroom smelled of chalk and cheap coffee. I sat beside a woman from Honduras and a man who worked in sanitation. We were all there for the same reason, to prove something, mostly to ourselves. The teacher, Miss Carter, was patient and kind. She said, "You're never too old to learn, you're just on God's timing." It wasn't easy. My shifts were long, my eyes tired, and sometimes I'd nod off during lessons. But each time, I'd picture my mama's face, proud, gentle, whispering, "Keep going, baby." I clung to that voice when math problems blurred and grammar rules tangled in my head. There were nights when the bus broke down and I'd walk the last few blocks home under the streetlights. My feet ached, my back burned, but I felt alive. I was doing something for me. It felt almost rebellious, like claiming a piece of freedom that had been waiting all along. One evening, my son Marcus found me at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks. He smiled and said, "Mom, you studying for a test?" I laughed, embarrassed. Something like that. He sat down and helped me with fractions until midnight. That moment, that quiet teamwork, meant everything. Then came the first test. I failed. Not badly, but enough to sting. I wanted to quit. I sat on the edge of my bed, tears slipping down my face, whispering, "Lord, maybe this isn't for me." But in that silence, I felt a whisper back, "Try again." So I did. The second time I passed. Barely, but enough to taste victory. I remember walking home with that paper clutched in my hand, grinning like a fool. I stopped by the church just to say thank you. Because sometimes, the smallest wins are the loudest hallelujahs. As months went by, my confidence grew. I started tutoring other students, especially those struggling with English. It was strange, me, the woman who once hid behind silence, now helping others find their voice. God was rewriting my story one lesson at a time. But life, as always, had other lessons planned. My husband lost his job around the same time my youngest got sick. Hospital visits, unpaid bills, sleepless nights, they came like storms. I thought about quitting school again. But something in me refused. I'd come too far to stop. One night, I missed class because my husband needed to be picked up from a bar. He stumbled out, angry, muttering, "Books won't fix this family." I didn't argue. I just drove in silence, praying under my breath. But that moment, that breaking point, lit something fierce inside me. I realized I wasn't studying for a better life. I was studying to remember who I was. A woman with purpose, not just pain. That understanding changed everything. My grades improved, my spirit lifted, and I started seeing myself not as a survivor, but as a student of grace. By the second year, I was one of the top in my class. Miss Carter asked me to give a small speech during orientation. My hands shook as I stood in front of new students and said, "You don't need to be young to begin again. You just need faith." The applause that followed felt like sunlight. Then came another twist. My husband's health started to decline. Doctors, pills, worry. I juggled caregiving and classes, falling asleep at bus stops, studying in hospital waiting rooms. I was exhausted, but I refused to surrender. Because sometimes, faith looks like showing up tired. The night before my final exam, the bus was late again. It was snowing hard, and my notes were soaked by the time I arrived. I wanted to cry, but I remembered something Miss Carter once said, "Nothing worth keeping comes easy." I smiled, wiped my pages dry, and took the test. When graduation day came in 2009, I wore a white dress I'd sewn myself. My children sat in the front row, clapping and shouting my name. When they called Sylvia Thomas, I walked across that stage with tears streaming down. I wasn't just holding a diploma. I was holding redemption. The principal shook my hand and whispered, "You did it." I wanted to tell him, "No, we did it." Me, my kids, my faith, my weary nights, my broken bus rides. Every thread of my life had led me to that moment. And for once, I didn't feel behind. I felt blessed. After the ceremony, Marcus hugged me tight and said, "You taught us more than school ever could." I laughed through tears. Because deep down, I knew that education wasn't about books, it was about belief. Believing that God's timing was never late, only perfect. But after that joy came silence. The kind that creeps into a house once the applause fades. My husband barely looked at me. He said, "So what now?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something inside me had changed, and he could feel it. Days turned into weeks, and I kept looking for new doors to open. Maybe college, maybe community work. But then came the nights of bottles clinking, tempers rising. I prayed harder, but peace felt far away. Sometimes faith means standing still when every instinct screams run. The children noticed too. They'd hide in their rooms when his voice grew loud. I tried to keep the house stitched together, cooking, cleaning, pretending, but the seams were tearing. Love had turned into duty. Home, once my refuge, was becoming a cage. And yet I held on. Because that's what women like me were taught to do. To endure. To keep the family intact, no matter how much it cost our spirit. But I started to wonder, does God really call us to stay in pain, or to rise from it? That question haunted me. There were moments of quiet hope too. Sunday mornings at church, I'd close my eyes and feel peace wash over me. The choir sang about deliverance, and I'd whisper, "Show me how." I didn't know then that the answer was already forming. Quietly, like dawn after a long night. My diploma hung on the wall above my sewing table. Every time I looked at it, I felt strength rise again. Proof that I could do hard things. Proof that God still had plans for me. But I didn't realize, the next test wouldn't be in a classroom. It would be in my own home. Because soon, the cracks that had been forming behind closed doors would start to split open, and no amount of thread would be enough to hold them together. It started quietly, the way most storms do, with small things you tell yourself not to notice. A slammed door. A sharp word. The sound of glass hitting the counter just a little too hard. I told myself Charles was just tired. That stress could make anyone mean. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. The night our second child was born, I remember holding that baby, thinking love could heal anything. But a few months later, Charles came home late, smelling of whiskey and rain. He looked at me, eyes glazed, and said, "Pack your things and go." I froze, waiting for him to laugh. He didn't. The next morning, he apologized. Said he didn't mean it. Said he was under pressure. I wanted to believe him, so I did. I'd been taught that forgiveness was the glue that kept families whole. But sometimes, forgiveness becomes another word for fear. At first, it was just words. Harsh, heavy, cutting through the air like knives. Then came the nights when bottles shattered against the wall, and I'd sweep the pieces in silence. My children learned to read moods instead of bedtime stories. We all became experts in quiet. I'd sit by my sewing machine, the hum barely drowning out the tension. My hands would shake, but I kept stitching. It was the only thing I could control. Every hem I finished felt like a prayer. Lord, hold this house together. But prayers don't always come with quick answers. He wasn't always cruel. Some mornings, he'd make coffee, kiss my cheek, and call me his girl. That was the hardest part, the whiplash between tenderness and terror. It kept me hoping. Hoping that the man I married still lived somewhere inside the man who'd replaced him. The first time he broke something I loved, my mother's porcelain vase, I felt something inside me crack too. Not anger, not yet. Just grief. I realized that sometimes what dies first in a marriage isn't love, it's safety. And once that's gone, everything else begins to unravel. I didn't tell anyone. Not my church friends, not my neighbors, not even my sister in Georgia. Shame is a quiet house you lock yourself inside of. You start decorating it, making excuses for the walls. You even learn to smile through the windows, so no one knocks on your door. There were good days too. Days when laughter returned, when we danced in the kitchen, when I believed maybe the worst was behind us. But those days never lasted. They came like sunlight between storms, brief, beautiful, and gone before you could warm your hands. One night, after another argument, he threw his keys across the room and shouted, "You think you're better than me now? With your little school diploma." That cut deep. Because it wasn't about the paper on the wall. It was about the power it gave me to see life beyond him. I learned to live in patterns. Mondays were calm. Fridays, dangerous. Sundays, unpredictable. I'd measure peace in hours, not days. And somehow, I kept sewing through it all. Because if I stopped, I'd have to feel, and feeling meant breaking. The children started noticing more. Marcus, my oldest, would pull his siblings into their room when Charles's voice rose. He'd look at me with that quiet question in his eyes, the one that said, "Why do we stay?" And I never had an answer that made sense. There was a night I'll never forget. He came home later than usual, drunk, angry, accusing me of things I hadn't done. The baby woke up crying. I tried to calm them both, whispering, "Please, not in front of the kids." But rage doesn't listen. It just grows. He threw a plate, and it shattered inches from my hand. The sound echoed through the house like thunder. For a moment, I saw my reflection in those shards, frightened, small, and so very tired. That's when I realized, I'd built a home on hope, but he'd filled it with fear. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I didn't know where I'd go, maybe to a friend's couch, maybe nowhere. But when I looked at my sleeping children, I stopped. Leaving meant protecting them, but it also meant tearing apart the only world they knew. So I unpacked it again. That became my routine, packing in secret, unpacking in guilt. Every time I'd tell myself, maybe next time it'll be better. The human heart has a dangerous talent for denial. We call it patience, but it's really survival dressed as hope. Then came the day he brought me flowers. Red roses, my favorite. He cried, apologized, swore he'd change. And for a while he did. We had peace for weeks. He started praying again, holding my hand during grace. I wanted to believe it was real. But deep down, I knew it was just the eye of the storm. Because peace built on fear is never permanent. One wrong word, one bad day, and everything fell apart again. The shouting, the slammed doors, the cold shoulders. I stopped sleeping. My sewing machine became my only companion at night. Its hum was steadier than his promises. I prayed constantly. For him, for me, for my children. I prayed for patience, for deliverance, for strength. But sometimes, prayers feel like letters you send without knowing the address. You just hope heaven's still listening. The Reviravolta came quietly. One evening, I found my youngest daughter hiding under the table, covering her ears. She looked up at me with eyes too old for her age and said, "Mommy, is Daddy mad at God?" I froze. That question shattered something deeper than fear. It broke denial. I realized then that the storm wasn't mine alone anymore. It had reached them. My silence had become their burden. My forgiveness, their fear. I had been sewing patches on a sinking ship, calling it faith. But faith doesn't mean staying chained, it means trusting God enough to walk away when He whispers, "Go." That night, after he fell asleep, I stood in the kitchen holding my Bible. I didn't read it. I just held it like armor. I whispered, "Lord, I can't do this alone." And in the stillness, I felt something shift, not around me, but inside me. The kind of peace that comes before courage. The next day, I started making plans. Small, secret, sacred. I opened a savings account. I spoke with a pastor's wife about shelters. I began collecting documents. Each step felt like a stitch toward freedom. It wasn't escape. It was resurrection. But I didn't tell the children yet. I wanted to protect their hope for just a little longer. Marcus noticed the change, though. "You look different, Mom," he said. "Lighter." I smiled. Because for the first time in years, the weight I carried wasn't just fear, it was resolve. There were still nights when he came home angry, but I didn't flinch the same way. I'd look him in the eye and think, "You don't own my peace." He didn't notice it yet, but something in me had broken free. Freedom always starts in silence. I started praying differently too. Not, "Lord, change him," but, "Lord, prepare me." And He did. In ways I couldn't see yet. Through people, through whispers, through strength that appeared exactly when I needed it. God's timing never rushes, but it never fails. The cracks in our home had become too wide to hide, but they also let light in. I didn't know what came next, only that the battle was no longer about survival. It was about legacy. Because if I stayed, my children would learn fear. But if I left, they might learn freedom. And deep down I knew, the real fight was only beginning. The day it stopped being just about me began like any other. The smell of coffee, the hum of the city outside, the quiet before he came home. But that night, the quiet turned heavy. I heard voices from the living room, Charles and Marcus. At first, I thought they were just talking. Then I heard the tone. Marcus was 20 then, in college, proud and hopeful. He just told his father he wanted to switch majors from business to art. "Art," Charles shouted. "You think life's about dreams?" I froze in the hallway, heart pounding. The air felt thick with old ghosts I'd tried to bury. Then came the words that still echo. "You're weak, just like your mother." My knees nearly buckled. Marcus didn't answer. I heard silence, the kind that speaks louder than shouting. When I walked in, Charles's hand was clenched, Marcus's eyes were wet, and the boy who once looked up to his father now looked afraid. That night, something inside me broke, but not like before. It wasn't fear this time. It was fire. I stood between them and said, "Enough." My voice was shaking, but steady. For the first time, I wasn't protecting peace. I was protecting my child. Charles stared at me, stunned. "You gonna take his side now?" he asked. I looked at him and said quietly, "I'm taking God's." He laughed, that cruel hollow sound I knew too well, and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The walls trembled, but I didn't. Not this time. Marcus tried to apologize. "I didn't mean to make him mad," he whispered. I held his face in my hands and said, "You didn't make him mad. His pain did." It was the first time I said it out loud, that what we were living wasn't normal. That it wasn't love anymore. The next day, I found a bruise on Marcus's arm. He swore it was nothing, that he'd bumped into the table. But I knew that kind of mark. I'd worn it too many times myself. That sight, that small, dark reminder, changed everything. My battle was no longer survival. It was rescue. I started watching more closely, listening, protecting in small, hidden ways. I'd keep the keys near me when Charles came home late. I'd turn up the radio so the younger ones wouldn't hear the yelling. I thought I could shield them. But pain has a way of seeping through the cracks. One night, Charles came home early. Marcus was at the kitchen table doing homework. I heard the first insult, then the second. By the third, I was already standing in the doorway. "You will not speak to him that way," I said. My voice was calm, but something in it made him pause. For a second I saw fear in him. He raised his voice, but I didn't back down. My hands were trembling, my heart racing, but I felt stronger than I ever had. Because in that moment, I realized, courage isn't loud. It's steady. It's standing when you used to hide. It's saying no more, when silence once felt safer. After that night, Marcus wouldn't look at his father the same way. Something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be patched. I tried to pray the anger out of the walls, but even prayer sounded tired in that house. It was like faith was whispering, "It's time to act." Weeks went by, but the tension grew thicker. The other kids started asking to sleep at friends' houses. The house felt haunted, not by spirits, but by memories that refused to leave. I'd wake up to silence that felt like warning. Even the air held its breath. Then came the night of the storm. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rolled, and Charles came home soaked and drunk. He started yelling about bills, about the kids, about me. I tried to stay calm, but Marcus stepped in again, his voice steady, his hands shaking. And then it happened. A shove. A crash. A scream. Time slowed. I saw Marcus hit the floor, his hand against his cheek, the disbelief in his eyes. It wasn't just pain. It was betrayal. My heart stopped. I ran to him, shielding his body with mine. And then I looked up. "You crossed the line," I said. That was the climax, the moment when the woman I used to be died. I stood up slowly, holding Marcus close, and I said it clear as day. "You will not touch my children again." My voice didn't shake. My soul did, but my voice didn't. That's when I saw it. The flicker of shame in his eyes. It was brief but real. He stormed out into the rain, cursing, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. The thunder outside sounded almost holy, like heaven roaring back. I sank to the floor, holding Marcus, whispering, "We're okay. We're okay." But I knew we weren't. We were broken in a way that wouldn't mend inside those walls. After that, everything changed. Marcus stopped coming home on weekends. My daughter started praying for quiet nights. Even the house looked different. Smaller somehow, like it knew what it had seen. I found myself folding laundry one day and realizing, this isn't a home anymore. It's a memory waiting to end. The Reviravolta came from the least expected place, church. A visiting pastor spoke about David facing Goliath, about fighting battles that seem impossible. And he said one thing that pierced my heart: sometimes, obedience means walking away. I cried through the entire sermon, because I knew God was speaking directly to me. I went home and opened my Bible. The page fell to Isaiah 54, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." I read it over and over until I could breathe again. It wasn't just a verse. It was permission. Permission to fight back. To protect. To leave. I began planning again, but this time, with certainty. I contacted a women's outreach counselor through the church. She spoke softly, like someone who'd been through the same fire. "You're not alone, Sylvia," she said. "God's already walking you out." Those words became my anchor. Still, guilt clung to me like smoke. I'd sit in church and wonder if leaving meant I'd failed my vows. But then I remembered, God never asked me to stay in pain to prove my faith. He asked me to trust Him enough to seek freedom. That's when the chains began to loosen. Charles tried to act like nothing had happened. He'd bring home gifts, make jokes, even sit beside me during dinner. But the laughter felt hollow. The house had changed. I had changed. You can't unsee the truth once God opens your eyes. You can't go back to blindness. One evening, Marcus came by to check on us. He hugged me tight and said, "You don't have to stay anymore, Mom." That broke me. All those years, I thought I was protecting them by staying. But in that moment, I realized, I was teaching them endurance when I should have been teaching them escape. After he left, I sat at my sewing machine, staring at the fabric under the needle. I pressed my foot against the pedal, and the hum filled the room. It sounded different this time, not like survival, but like preparation. As if God was whispering through the motor, "Get ready." The younger kids started sleeping in my room when the nights grew tense. I'd pray over them softly, tracing little crosses on their foreheads. "Lord, keep their hearts soft," I'd whisper. "Don't let pain harden them." I didn't know it yet, but those prayers were building the bridge we'd soon cross. There were still good days, deceptive little glimpses of normal. But peace built on apology is fragile. It doesn't hold under pressure. Every time I thought maybe things were improving, the shouting returned, louder than before. Until even the walls seemed to tremble with exhaustion. The final Reviravolta came unexpectedly. One morning, I found a letter in Marcus's old room. It was addressed to me. He'd written, "Mom, you taught me how to fight. Now it's your turn. Don't let the pain win." I held that letter to my chest and cried until the sun came up. It was the push I needed. I realized then, the fight wasn't against Charles. It was against fear. Against silence. Against the lie that women like me are meant to endure forever. I stood in front of the mirror, looked at the woman staring back, and said out loud, "No more." It wasn't loud, but it was final. From that day forward, I began saving again. $1 here, 2 there. Small acts of defiance disguised as grocery change. Every coin was a seed of freedom. And even though I didn't know when or how, I knew the day was coming. The day I'd finally walk out, not just of that house, but into my life. Because once pain reaches the children, the choice is no longer about leaving. It's about living. And I was finally ready to choose life. When I finally left the old house behind, I thought peace would come instantly. But peace doesn't rush. It unfolds slowly, like dawn after a long night. At first, I just breathed, really breathed, for the first time in years. I'd walk to the corner store, buy an apple, and think, this is freedom. The silence felt strange. Too big. Too clean. There were no slammed doors, no echoes of fear. Just me, my Bible, and a heart learning to beat without permission. But soon, silence became something else, a space for questions. "What now, Lord?" I asked. What am I supposed to do with the rest of my life? One morning, while volunteering at a food pantry in the Bronx, I overheard two women talking about the upcoming local elections. They were frustrated, tired of promises, tired of being ignored. And one of them said, "Maybe we need someone like us in office." My heart stirred. I thought, why not me? It sounded ridiculous at first. Me, a former seamstress, a mother, a survivor, running for office? But the thought wouldn't leave me alone. It followed me home, into my prayers, into my dreams. Maybe God was asking me to use my voice for more than prayer. Maybe He wanted me to speak. I started small, attending meetings, volunteering at community events, listening to stories that sounded like my own. Women raising grandchildren, men working 3 jobs, teens fighting to stay out of trouble. I saw myself in all of them. We were different threads in the same torn fabric. Then one evening at church, Pastor Green said, "If you want change, stop waiting for someone else to sew it. Pick up your own needle." I laughed out loud because that was my language. God wasn't just calling me, He was calling me in my own dialect of faith. So I ran. Not away this time, but toward. I filled out the forms, gathered signatures, and put my name on the ballot for Bronx City Council. My hands trembled as I pressed that final submit button. It felt like stitching my courage into the city's fabric. At first, people laughed. "Sylvia, the tailor lady," they'd say. "You don't even have campaign money." But I had something stronger, a story. So I started knocking on doors. I didn't talk about policies. I talked about people. About faith, about dignity, about never being too old to start again. Some nights, I came home exhausted, my feet swollen, my voice gone. But I'd look at myself in the mirror and think, "You're still standing, girl. You're still sowing hope." I'd pray over my shoes like they were sacred, because every step felt like holy ground. And then something strange happened. People started listening. Neighbors, store owners, even teens who'd never voted before. They'd say, "You speak like you know." I'd smile and say, "That's because I've lived it." I wasn't just campaigning. I was testifying. The first Reviravolta came during a live debate. My opponent, polished, young, confident, looked at me and said, "Mrs. Thomas, what makes you think you can lead this community?" The crowd grew quiet. I smiled and said, "Because I already have, one family, one stitch, one prayer at a time." The room erupted. That night, I went home and cried, not from fear, but from gratitude. I knew I wouldn't win by numbers. But maybe I could win by impact. Maybe God didn't send me to take the seat. Maybe He sent me to shake the table. Election day came cold and gray. I wore my best dress and a purple scarf, the color of bruises that healed and royalty reclaimed. I lost by a few hundred votes. When they announced it, I smiled. Because in my heart, I hadn't lost a thing. I'd found my voice, and that was worth more than any title. After the election, something beautiful happened. Women from all over the neighborhood came to see me. They said, "You made us believe we could do something too." And I thought, maybe this was the victory all along. Influence doesn't need a crown, it just needs conviction. Then came the second Reviravolta. During a post-election checkup, my doctor frowned at my chart. "Sylvia," she said gently, "your blood pressure's too high. You need to slow down." I laughed, but it stuck with me. My body was finally saying what my soul had whispered for years. Rest. So I joined a seniors walking club in Queens. The first day, I could barely keep up. My legs ached, my breath came short. But those women, strong, loud, joyful, kept me laughing all the way around the park. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by women who celebrated being alive. We met every morning, rain, shine, or snow. We'd walk, talk, pray, and share stories about love and loss. It wasn't just exercise. It was healing disguised as movement. I started sleeping better, eating better, even smiling from the inside again. Within 6 months, I'd lost weight, gained strength, and rediscovered something precious: joy. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that lives in your chest like a steady flame. Every breath felt like a second chance. One afternoon, while resting on a park bench, I looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Because I realized, the same lungs that once gasped through fear were now filled with peace. That's what God does. He doesn't just rescue you. He rebuilds you. Then came the third Reviravolta, a flyer taped to the community center door. Join the Purple Room Project, a space for women to create, heal, and connect. I stood there, reading it over and over. Something about those words felt personal, like an invitation straight from heaven. I hesitated at first. Another group. Another cause. I'd done enough, hadn't I? But something in my spirit nudged me. The kind of nudge that sounds like God whispering, "There's more for you to do." So I wrote down the address. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my Bible. That night I prayed, "If this is you, Lord, open the door." I didn't know then how wide that door would swing. Because sometimes, the next chapter of healing begins not with a plan, but with a single step toward a purple door that leads you right back to yourself. The first time I saw the sign, it was taped crookedly to the glass door of the Queen's Community Center. The Purple Room Project, a space for women to create, heal, and connect. I almost walked past it. But something about that word, purple, stopped me. It carried both pain and power. Inside, the room smelled of lavender and old wood. There were sewing machines, art supplies, and tables full of fabric scraps. A group of women sat in a circle, laughing softly. One of them looked up and said, "You're new here, aren't you?" I nodded, suddenly shy, suddenly curious. I didn't know it then, but that small step through that purple doorway would change everything. It wasn't just a room. It was a refuge. The walls seemed to hum with stories, not loud ones, but whispers of survival. I took a seat and felt something inside me exhale. The leader, Miss Janice, welcomed me with a smile that felt like sunlight. "Here," she said, handing me a basket of fabric, "we make things from what's been torn." Her words hit deep. Because that's exactly what life had been. One long repair. That first day, we made dolls. Not fancy ones, just simple cloth dolls. Brown-skinned, wide-eyed, stitched with love. I hadn't sewn anything that wasn't for survival in years. But as the needle moved, I felt warmth spreading through my chest. Healing, quiet but certain. The woman next to me, Gloria, told me she'd left a violent marriage too. 15 years, she said. But I made it out. I looked at her hands, strong, scarred, gentle. She smiled and added, "You will feel whole again. Give it time." It was the first time someone said that to me without pity. Each week I came back. The room became my sanctuary. We laughed, cried, prayed, and stitched side by side. I started to recognize the rhythm of hope, steady, like the hum of my old sewing machine. Except this time, I wasn't alone. The second Reviravolta came unexpectedly, the day we displayed our dolls at a local art fair. A little girl stopped in front of mine and whispered, "She looks like me." Her mother smiled, eyes brimming with tears. That moment hit me like a wave. Representation. That's what I'd been searching for all along. From then on, I started adding details. Gray yarn hair for wisdom, tiny crosses sewn into the hems, bright African prints for joy. Each doll became a prayer stitched into fabric. A piece of testimony wrapped in color. One evening as we packed up, Miss Janice said, "You should teach a class, Sylvia." I laughed out loud. "Me? Teach?" She nodded. "You've got something sacred in those hands. Share it." The thought both scared and thrilled me. I started small, just a few women, a few dolls. But soon, word spread. Our little corner of the community center overflowed with women of all ages. Grandmothers, single moms, teenagers. Each came with a story, and somehow, every story found its way into fabric. We called it soul stitching. It wasn't about perfect seams. It was about mending what life had torn. Every class began with prayer. Every doll ended with a name. "We're sewing spirits back together," Gloria used to say. And she was right. The third Reviravolta came when a local journalist visited to write an article about us. She asked, "What made you start this?" I hesitated, then said, "Pain did. But faith finished it." The next week, our story appeared in the paper, "The Women Who Sew Strength." Suddenly, people started calling, donating, volunteering. I couldn't believe it. The same hands that once trembled from fear were now creating something that healed others. Sometimes I'd sit alone after class, looking at the rows of dolls lined up on the table, thinking, this is what resurrection looks like. But healing isn't a straight line. Some nights, memories crept back. The shouting, the glass, the fear. I'd wake up sweating, trembling. Yet even then, I'd reach for the small doll I kept on my nightstand, the first one I ever made. I'd hold it close and whisper, "God fixed me once, He'll fix me again." The room kept growing, in number, in energy, in faith. Women brought their daughters, nieces, even neighbors. It became a sisterhood, not of perfection, but of persistence. We were all broken in different ways, but together, we were beautiful. Then one day, Miss Janice told me she was moving to Florida. "You're ready to lead," she said. I panicked. "No, I'm not." She smiled. "You already are." That night, I prayed harder than ever, asking God if I could carry this mantle. His silence wasn't absence. It was confidence. So I did it. I took over the program. We repainted the walls lavender and hung up a sign, "The Purple Room, where healing begins." When I unlocked the door for our first meeting under my care, I cried. Because that key didn't just open a room. It opened a purpose. I started inviting speakers, artists, poets, social workers, women who'd turned pain into passion. Each week, the stories deepened. Some came trembling. Some came laughing through tears. All left a little lighter. We began organizing events, fashion shows with our dolls, church exhibits, storytelling nights. The Purple Room became a movement. But for me, it was still personal. Every time I taught, I healed a little more. Every time I prayed with another woman, my own wounds closed further. Then came a moment I'll never forget. During one session, a woman named Ruth shared her story, nearly identical to mine. As she cried, I held her hands and whispered, "You're safe here." In her tears, I saw my reflection, and my redemption. From that night on, I understood. Healing doesn't erase pain. It transforms it. It takes what was broken and turns it into a bridge for someone else. That realization was my climax, the moment I finally forgave not just him, but myself. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since my school days. The words poured out like confession and worship all at once. Soon, I began reading them aloud to the group. They said my words brought peace. I didn't realize they were preparing me for what came next. Because soon, writing, not sewing, would become my next form of healing. A new way to tell stories, to give shape to the lessons my scars had taught. The Purple Room had been the thread. But the next chapter would be the fabric itself, woven from art, words, and the holy act of becoming whole again. It began with a notebook, plain, spiral-bound, the kind you buy for $1 at the corner store. I started writing one night after class, just to quiet the noise in my mind. But once I began, I couldn't stop. Words flowed like water from a faucet I didn't know was still working. At first, they were just fragments, memories, prayers, bits of conversations I'd had with God in the dark. But slowly, the lines began to form stories. Not perfect ones, but honest. Each word felt like stitching, except this time, the fabric was my heart. I brought my notebook to the Purple Room one day, thinking I might read a small piece aloud. My hands trembled as I spoke. The room went silent. When I finished, a woman whispered, "That's exactly how I feel." And just like that, I realized, pain shared becomes power. From then on, every Thursday, we ended class with writing. Some wrote letters to their younger selves. Others wrote prayers, poems, or fragments of forgiveness. We read them out loud, laughing and crying through the words. It was messy, beautiful, real. The first Reviravolta came when Miss Gloria submitted one of my short pieces, without telling me, to a local literary project called The Diary of Hope. Weeks later, I got an email. Congratulations, your story has been accepted for publication. I thought it was a mistake. It wasn't. I stood frozen in front of the computer, tears spilling down my cheeks. Me. Published. At my age. After everything. I whispered. Look what you've done, Lord. It felt like God had taken my brokenness and turned it into a testimony bound in ink. The launch was held at the New York Book Fair, a place I never imagined my feet would walk. The air buzzed with creativity, with possibility. When I held the book in my hands, it felt like holding my own heart, finally heard. During the reading, I spoke my story into a microphone for the first time. My voice shook at first, but by the end, it grew strong, clear, like truth being released. People stood. They clapped. A woman hugged me afterward and said, "You gave me courage." That moment changed me. I started getting invitations, small panels, church readings, workshops. Every time, I'd stand before strangers and speak about faith, survival, and the beauty of second chances. And every time, I'd leave a little lighter. Because healing grows when shared. But writing did more than heal. It reintroduced me to joy. I started waking up excited again, not just to survive the day, but to create it. My mornings became rituals of coffee, scripture, and sentences. I'd whisper, "Holy Spirit, write with me today." Then came the second Reviravolta, an invitation from a local theater group in Harlem. They wanted me to audition for a small role in a community play. I laughed out loud. Me. On stage. But something in me, that brave, quiet part God had rebuilt, said, why not? The play was called The Father's Wedding. Ironically, they asked me to play the groom's father. I hesitated, but the director said, "Don't think about the role. Think about the truth behind it." And I did. Standing under the spotlight, wearing that old suit, I felt layers of my past falling away. During rehearsal, one of the younger actors asked, "How do you make it look so real?" I smiled and said, "Because I've lived through enough pretending." The audience laughed, but inside, I was trembling, not with fear, but with freedom. Opening night arrived like a sunrise. The lights dimmed, the curtain rose, and when my cue came, I spoke every word like a prayer. I wasn't acting. I was remembering. And redeeming. When the final applause came, it wasn't just for the play. It was for survival itself. After the show, a woman in the audience came up to me crying. "You reminded me of my father," she said. "I forgave him tonight." That moment felt holy. Because art, when born from pain, becomes ministry. It touches places sermons can't reach. From that night on, I wasn't just a seamstress or a survivor. I was an artist, a storyteller. I'd spent my whole life stitching stories into fabric. Now, I was stitching them into hearts. Then the third Reviravolta came, a letter from a community college in Jersey. They were offering a small teaching position in their art therapy program. "We'd love for you to lead a workshop on creative healing," it read. My heart skipped. Me, a teacher, again. I prayed long and hard about it. "Lord, am I worthy of this?" And in the quiet, I felt his answer. "You were always worthy. You just needed time to see it." That was enough. I said yes. My first class was a mix of students, young, old, quiet, searching. I told them, "This isn't about writing well. It's about telling the truth beautifully." They looked at me wide-eyed, as if truth could be art. And it can. It's the most sacred art there is. We read scriptures and poems, wrote letters of forgiveness, even acted out scenes from our lives. Every class ended with laughter and prayer. Sometimes, I'd walk home under the streetlights and think, God, you really do make all things new. But not every day was easy. Some stories brought back memories I thought I'd buried for good. There were nights when I'd close my notebook and cry. Healing is a journey, not a finish line. Some pages you write through tears, but you write them anyway. The climax came one afternoon when a young woman stayed after class. She said, Ms. Sylvia, I was going to give up on everything. Then I read your story. Now I want to live. My heart stopped. I held her hands and whispered, You're already living, sweetheart. God's not done with you yet. I walked home that evening under a pink sky, the city glowing golden at dusk. For the first time in my 70 years, I felt full, not of fear or longing, but of purpose. Every chapter of my life, even the darkest ones, had led here. Sometimes I'd visit the old neighborhoods, Brooklyn, Harlem, Queens, and smile. Every street corner was a thread in my story. The same city that once swallowed me whole had become my canvas. And as I stood in my tiny apartment one night, surrounded by dolls, notebooks, and scripts, I realized art had become my new faith. Not separate from God, but woven into Him. Because creation, in any form, is just another word for prayer. I started working on a book of my own, Threads of Grace. I didn't know if anyone would publish it. That wasn't the point. The point was to leave a map for someone else, a way through the darkness, one page at a time. And while I was writing, I began to feel another stirring. Soft, steady, unmistakable. The kind that means change is coming again. I'd learned by now that when God moves, He doesn't warn you, He whispers. Because soon, I'd face the hardest step of all. Not creating, not healing, but truly leaving. Leaving the place where the old ghosts still lingered, and stepping into a new life that felt like peace. And that's how my final chapter began. Not with goodbye, but with breath. Leaving wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate, like unpicking a seam that had held too long. One morning, I looked around the apartment I'd shared with Charles for 40 years and realized I was surrounded by ghosts. Memories too loud to ignore. I stood there, coffee growing cold in my hand, and whispered, It's time. There was no shouting, no grand exit. Just quiet packing. A few clothes, my Bible, my sewing kit, and that small doll from the Purple Room. Everything else, the furniture, the photos, the dishes, stayed behind. I was done carrying what no longer held life. The air outside felt different that day. Sharper, cleaner, almost holy. I took one deep breath and felt it fill every corner of me that had been empty for decades. It wasn't just oxygen. It was grace. I wasn't running away anymore. I was walking toward peace. My first stop was Jersey City. My friend Gloria helped me find a small one-bedroom near the waterfront. It wasn't much, thin walls, leaky faucet, creaky floorboards, but it was mine. The first night, I slept without fear. That, to me, was wealth. I woke up early the next morning, sunlight spilling through thin curtains. I made coffee, sat on the floor, and prayed. Thank you, Lord, I whispered, for this silence, for this new beginning. I didn't have a plan, just faith. And somehow, that felt like enough. The neighbors were kind, mostly older women, quiet but warm. One of them, Miss Evelyn, brought me a pie and said, You look like someone who's finally breathing again. I smiled. That's exactly what I'm doing, I said. And she laughed like she understood. My days found new rhythm. Morning walks, community meetings, church on Sundays. I started helping at a local shelter, teaching women how to sew, how to mend, how to start over. Every stitch was a sermon, every class a prayer. Healing had become my language. Then came the first Reviravolta, a letter from Charles. He wrote that he was sick, that he wanted to talk, that he was sorry. My hands shook as I read it. 4 years, I'd imagined this moment. But when it came, I didn't feel anger or pity, just peace. I prayed on it for days. The Lord didn't give me words, only calm. So I wrote back simply, I forgive you. Take care of yourself. God is merciful. Then I folded the letter, mailed it, and released a weight I didn't realize I was still carrying. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's freedom. It's saying, you don't owe me any more, and I don't owe you my pain. That letter became my final act of closure, the last thread cut, so new fabric could form. After that, life grew lighter. I joined a support group called Silver Women Rising, women over 60 who'd rebuilt after loss. We shared stories, laughter, recipes, even dreams. It felt like family, the kind you choose, not the kind that hurts. We took day trips, small adventures that made us feel young again. Coney Island, Times Square at Christmas, the Botanical Gardens in Brooklyn. I'd catch myself laughing so hard my ribs ached. Joy had returned, wearing sneakers and sunglasses. One afternoon, I walked by the Hudson River, watching the boats drift past. The sun shimmered over the water like a promise. I whispered, "You did it, Sylvia. Not perfectly, not easily, but wholly." God had kept every promise, even the ones I didn't know he'd made. Then the second Rivera Volta arrived, a phone call from Marcus. He'd become a teacher, married, and had 2 little girls. "Mom," he said, "they want to meet Grandma." My heart leapt. I hadn't realized how much of me still longed to belong. The first time I held those girls, they smelled like vanilla and sunshine. One of them touched my gray curls and said, "Grandma, your hair sparkles." I laughed through tears. Because for the first time in decades, I saw my reflection in love, not survival. I started visiting often, cooking, telling stories, showing them how to sew little patches onto their dolls. Always fix what's worth keeping, I told them. And if it's not, don't be afraid to start something new. Those were lessons I'd bled to learn. Then one day, Marcus handed me a framed photo, our family at the park, smiling. "You're our glue, Mom," he said softly. I smiled back. "No," I said. "God is. I'm just the thread he used." He laughed, but I meant it. Every good thing came from him. In my 70s, I thought life would slow down. Instead, it bloomed again. I started journaling every morning, writing gratitude lists instead of grievances. My home became a sanctuary, soft music, lavender candles, a vase of fresh flowers every Friday. The third Rivera Volta came when I was invited to speak at a women's retreat in upstate New York. I hesitated at first. What could I possibly say that they don't already know? I told my pastor. He smiled and said, "Tell them what freedom feels like." So I did. Standing on that stage, looking at a sea of women, young, old, weary, radiant, I shared everything. The fear, the faith, the leaving, the living. I said, peace isn't a place, it's a decision. When I finished, they stood, clapping through tears. It felt like heaven touched earth. After the retreat, a young woman hugged me tight. "You gave me courage," she whispered. I smiled. "God gave it to you," I said. "I just reminded you it was there." That's what purpose felt like. Not glory, but grace recycled. Back home, I started something new, Threads of Faith, a mentorship circle for women starting over. We met once a month, prayed, crafted, dreamed. Some brought daughters, some came alone, all left a little stronger. It was the Purple Room reborn, only brighter. One evening, as I walked home from a meeting, I passed a bridal shop window. A young woman stood inside, trying on a gown, twirling before the mirror. I smiled. My reflection appeared beside hers, gray-haired, content, unshaken. I whispered, "Go live your story, sweetheart." At 73, I felt younger than I had at 30. My knees ached, sure, but my soul danced. I'd traded pain for peace, fear for freedom. Every morning, I'd wake and say, "Thank you, Lord, for another day to breathe." Because living had become worship. I visited Charles once more before he passed. He was frail, quiet, unrecognizable from the man I'd known. He took my hand and said, "You turned out stronger than both of us." I smiled gently. "No, Charles. God turned my weakness into strength." He nodded, eyes full of regret and peace. When he was gone, I didn't cry long. Grief came, but softly, like rain washing away old dust. I felt compassion, not bitterness. Because by then, I'd learned that closure isn't about endings. It's about peace that stays. Now, in my little Jersey City apartment, the walls are lined with photos, art, and dolls, each one a chapter, a testimony. My story began with thread and tears. It ended with grace and light. I can finally say, I lived. And as I sit here tonight, looking out at the skyline of New York City, the same one that once scared me, I smile. I see not a city of noise and struggle, but of rebirth. My mountains didn't move on their own. God moved me. Because in the end, leaving wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of truly living. Sometimes, I still wake before dawn and sit by the window with my coffee, watching the world wake up. The city hums, soft and distant, like an old friend. I think about the girl who left Georgia with a suitcase full of dreams and a heart full of faith. She had no idea that the same hands that sewed dresses would one day stitch lives back together. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that peace isn't found in places, it's found in decisions. The moment you say, "I choose to live," heaven leans in to listen. Maybe you've been holding on to something that's breaking you. Maybe you've been silent too long. But hear me. God still has a plan for you. You're never too old, too tired, or too broken to begin again. I used to think second chances were for the lucky ones. Now I know they're for the faithful ones. The ones who dare to believe that their story isn't over, even when the last page looks blank. So, let me ask you, have you ever felt like life stitched you into a pattern you didn't choose? Have you ever wanted to pull the thread and start over? What if the unraveling isn't the end? What if it's how God begins to remake you? When I finally let go, I didn't lose anything worth keeping. I found peace, purpose, and a voice I didn't know I had. You can too. Whatever storm you've walked through, I promise, it didn't destroy you. It prepared you. Take this moment, right now, and breathe. Really breathe. You're still here, and that means grace still has work to do in you. Maybe your new beginning starts today. Maybe this story found you because God wanted to whisper that it's your turn to rise. And before you go, I just want to say this from my heart. May God bless you with His infinite love. May He fill your days with health, laughter, and unwavering faith. No matter what you've lost, remember, His love never leaves, and His mercy never ends. If this story touched you in any way, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, so you can keep walking this journey of hope, faith, and renewal with me. You never know whose heart your share might heal next. So tell me, have you ever had to leave something behind just to live again? What would freedom look like for you, if you finally said yes to it? Because, darling, it's never too late to start over. And peace, I've learned, isn't a place. It's a decision.